The FBI has collected 21.7 million DNA profiles, or about 7% of the U.S. population, according to Bureau data reviewed by The Intercept. The agency allegedly aims to nearly double its current $56.7 million budget for dealing with its DNA catalog with an additional $53.1 million. Now, that's according to its budget request for fiscal year 2024.
The appeal for an increase says the requested resources will allow the FBI to process the rapidly increasing number of DNA samples collected by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Journalist at The Intercept, Ken Klippenstein, is here with us to discuss. Welcome back, Ken.
Hey, guys. Good to be with you again.
All right. So there are some people out there in the zeitgeist I saw in responding to this story. I think Matt Iglesias was one of them that said, look, it's good to catch more criminals. If your DNA isn't at the scene, why should you be concerned? Any comparisons to this being a policy that's like what they do in China are just kind of fear-mongering without basis. So why should people be concerned about a rapidly expanding DNA archive being held by the FBI?
Well, I interviewed some DNA experts in this story, and what they pointed to was the fact that just because DNA is present in a crime scene doesn't necessarily mean that someone was implicated in it or even involved in any sort of way. And the second part of this is, we can still collect DNA and use that in criminal prosecutions. The question is, how far do we want to go with this? The present system that we have, any felon is put into the DNA database. In addition to that, anyone sentenced in relation to a felony. So they use this. Prosecutors will plead down charges to misdemeanors in many cases, and in exchange for whatever it is they agree to, including their DNA sample being put into this database. And it's not just criminals. They are collecting millions of samples at the southern border, a policy that actually harkens back to the Obama administration. There's a very bipartisan basis for all of this, and which was really put into full force under the Trump administration, and which the Biden administration has not reversed. So the question, as I quote in the story, a Harvard genetics ethicist says, do we want to move in the direction in which we're going, which is having a full, comprehensive DNA database? And that's not really a debate I think that the public has had.
I remember when the suspect was apprehended in the University of Idaho murders. It was DNA evidence, and not because he himself had ever done a 23andMe or something like that, but some family member had, and then they can plausibly verify with whatever it is, 99% accuracy that that's his DNA, that kind of thing. Are we in a situation where, despite this being concerning from a civil liberties standpoint, there's ultimately nothing that can be done over time to prevent the government from just kind of collecting this information by default?
Well, these are policy choices that are made. There was in 2017 the DNA, I think it was called Fingerprinting Act, that had overwhelming bipartisan support that has really thrown the doors open to all of this. And in the case of commercial enterprises that are gathering these things, there are still serious limits on the FBI collecting from that on a sort of bulk basis, and they can certainly strengthen that with future legislation. That remains a sort of barrier. A lot of the 21 million samples of the DNA that the FBI has collected has not been under that basis. It's been under other means of collection. So things could actually get significantly worse in that respect. And that's sort of the debate that I'm trying to trigger with this story is, where do we want the guardrails to be and how far do we want to go? Because, you mentioned, critics of these things. There's this kind of false choice between, people are saying you don't want to use DNA. No, I'm not saying that. We can use DNA. The question is, on what sort of targeted basis, what kind of privacy protections are people who have not opted into these programs, family members, things like that have been. And those are things we can create policies around.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know that I have been very hesitant, despite some curiosity, about doing a 23andMe because it just feels instinctively too much of a personal exposure to make your DNA information available broadly. And I don't have a lot of confidence, for exactly the reasons you're describing, that information wouldn't be shared with those who might have an interest against my own. And it also seems to me the fingerprinting example that you brought up, is interesting because it does seem to be that unlike a fingerprint, which can basically tell folks where you've been, the DNA information gives a bigger insight into potentially aspects about your genetic predispositions. There has been ethical discourse about whether or not there can be discrimination from insurance providers or employers on the basis of health information that could be potentially gleaned from genetic analysis as these things get increasingly sophisticated. How much of that sort of thing was brought up by the ethicist that you spoke to as we consider whether or not, from a policy perspective, we want to encourage the FBI to have access to this sort of information?
Yeah, those were exactly our sorts of concerns. And, the experts I interviewed thought that the comparisons to communist China were warranted, not because we're, in exactly the same position by any means, but that they embody a certain direction in which society can go, in which we need to debate and decide, do we want to go in this direction in which the state gathers everything and is able to dole out, whether it's a social credit system or, as you're saying, genetic predispositions and factor that into, healthcare policy and things like that. That's obviously an extreme, but that is one direction in which society can go. Another one is, still using DNA, but on a highly targeted basis with protections in place. And I want to stress concerns about the government's ability to protect this information, even if they're not intentionally, sharing it with other parties. I think is warranted because if you look at their inspector general, their watchdog reports, it is a matter of course that they are finding insufficient privacy protections put in place for all sorts of information that they collect about Americans, not just DNA. So this isn't a abstract concern. Again and again, the government is found to not put safeguards in place to prevent things from everything from hacks to poorly designed software that people can access. So I think that these are very salient concerns and not ones that, should be taking place only in the aegis of academia, which unfortunately is the case now.
Where do you think the public is on this? People are, rightly concerned about their privacy, their internet privacy. You have some kind of philosophical concerns about government having access to this, but then when there's a crisis or an emergency or a crime, as we saw going back to the Patriot Act era and everything that's happened since, a lot of concerns for civil liberties go right out the door and are well supported by majorities of people. So where do you think the people are on this kind of thing, and how do we sell them on being a little bit more wary of when the government says it really needs this information, it's such a good idea?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. One big factor here is the post 9/11 era, which really threw the doors open to all kinds of things that would raise concerns about civil liberties. I would just point to what the ACLU was saying when they first unrolled the FBI's DNA database called CODIS, and they were saying initially it was only for violent felons, and I think it was people charged with sexual crimes, and they said it's just going to be the worst of the worst. Don't worry about it. And the ACLU said, this is a slippery slope, guys. They're going to start with that, and it's going to expand. And that's exactly what's happened, to the point that they're now, in many cases, able to collect on people that haven't even been charged with a crime. In over half of U.S. states, they've made it so that as soon as you're arrested for something, it's a felony offense. And completely irrespective of what a jury or your peers has decided, they can collect that DNA. So the ACLU has been right in the past, and I imagine that these problems will continue to metastasize as the technology becomes more sophisticated. I was surprised to learn in the course of this reporting that they, at the very frontier of what our science can do now, they can gather DNA from air that you exhale. So they're doing this now. There's a Pentagon contract now.
Oh my God! We got to mask up. Come on, Robbie.
I'm just going to stop exhaling.
We got to mask up. Robbie just is going to stop breathing over here instead. Sorry, I don't mean to joke about it. But that is incredible, and it makes you think that maybe there's just no stopping it as technology develops. That they're not going to need. They just don't need your consent. And given that there's so much a lack of transparency in these deep state organizations anyway, I do wonder if we're all talking past each other and they're going to do what they're going to do. But thank you so much for joining us, Ken. This is a fascinating report.
I appreciate it, guys. Good seeing you.